Hello everyone, my name's Jeff Davis. Today I'm going to begin a series of different presentations on the use of MuleSoft accelerators. If you're not familiar with accelerators, these are pre-built technical assets and blueprints that are built specifically for certain use cases. So for instance, there's an accelerator that we're going to talk about today that is used for open banking. They have other accelerators related to the healthcare industry. They have different examples, for instance, for interfacing and interacting with SAP. So these things are a set of, most often, a set of API specifications that really represent reference type architectures for the most common use cases involved in those platforms. So, in the case, for instance, of open banking, it has these accelerators to help you with core banking functionality, such as setting up an account, a credit card account. They've got ones related in financial services to consent management, to onboarding, to wealth and asset management. So these are really a prepackaged set of examples, if you will, that can help you more quickly develop solutions that are tailored for those specific verticals. Um, and so if you go, you can actually see the full selection of these products that are available if you go to MuleSoft's Anypoint Exchange. And if you don't have currently a Cloudhub account with MuleSoft, I will provide instructions on the link below that describes how to set up. I believe it's like a 15-day trial account for Cloudhub. Perhaps it's longer than that, I don't recall. And also then how to download Anypoint Studio, which is MuleSoft's IDE for developing these integration applications that subsequently can be deployed within MuleSoft's Cloudhub. But if you sign up for Cloudhub, and actually I don't think you need to sign up to actually be able to search on some of these accelerators. It's publicly available through MuleSoft.com/exchange. And if you search on accelerators, you'll get a kind of a first-hand view of some of the different ones that are available. So, for instance, they've got ones that are tailored for retail. I already alluded to financial services, healthcare. And I think that the intention, anyway, is to continue to build up these set of pre-built best practice applications to help customers move quickly forward in their MuleSoft journey. Um, so one of the things, if you look at what MuleSoft talks about, is there's a couple of different ways that one can work with these accelerators. One, and I think the most one that's typically pitched by MuleSoft, which we'll go into in just a moment, is to basically download these implementation templates, which you can then import into Anypoint Studio, and it has the whole pre-built integration essentially mocked up for you. Um, but I think more often than not, my experience anyway indicates that you really have to tailor these solutions. You're not, if you work in the banking industry, you're not going to be able to just download some template application, wire together some back-end components, and then call it a day. So I think there's going to be far greater customization. So the approach I tend to advocate and suggest is, instead of downloading the implementation templates that you can import then into Studio and actually build an integration from, is to begin more of a top-down approach where you're actually downloading or pulling in the API specifications and then tailoring those to meet your specific needs. Because whatever is developed out of the box, in all likelihood, is not going to be exactly what you're looking for. So that's kind of what I'm going to start with today. In a subsequent presentation, then I'm going to go into the actual implementation of one of these accelerators, in this case using a financial services one, and kind of describe how one can work with that. If you're not very familiar with Mule, it'll provide, I think, a good overview of getting started. So let's begin. I'm going to discuss two different approaches for utilizing these templates. As we searched on it previously, we saw some of the list of the available accelerators that came up. We'll click on the one for financial services. And what this provides, some quite good documentation that provides an overview of what the various services do as it relates to this accelerator. And from the available assets, you can see there's quite a number that they've made available, which is quite helpful. So for purposes of this example, we'll use the core banking system API. As you can see, there's two different options available. We're going to, for now, choose the implementation template. And when I select that, what it will do is it will allow me to download a jar file that I can then import directly into Anypoint Studio. And it will then contain the implementation of this particular integration. So I've downloaded that. Now if I go into Anypoint Studio, there's the file that we've downloaded. If I go into Anypoint Studio, I can now import that directly into Studio. So I'll do a package Mule application under Anypoint Studio. So after a few moments delay while it compiles everything, it'll then bring it up. And as you can see, this is like a full implementation of this particular accelerator. As you might imagine, there's quite a bit of underlying setup that would be required to run this as is on your local desktop. For instance, you could see here it's making some calls to a database stored procedure. So there's some preliminary work that you would need to set up in order to make this actually function. Well, I think this is beneficial because certainly it helps you understand, and this is particularly the case for people learning MuleSoft, kind of helps you understand some of the best practices for how to develop and design these integrations. So you can see, they've utilized the try-catch type capabilities to make the solution more robust. And so it's just by looking through this example alone, you can probably glean quite a bit of useful information, even for more experienced MuleSoft developers. However, in our particular case, we want to do more of a top-down design approach, because for purposes of this, we're only going to implement a few of the actual endpoints. And this is somewhat overkill, and again, it's completely tailored for the specific solution that they've identified. So a more meaningful way, in my opinion anyway, is to actually download the API and then from a top-down perspective begin to implement it. So the way in which we'll do that is if we go back to the go back a page. Sorry about that. Let's go back here. If we go back to our accelerator, in this case, what I'm going to do is actually go to the API specification. So if you click on this, it then takes you to the definition of the API itself, and you can see the various endpoints that are available, and you can also then actually test the service out against a mocking service, which can be really useful for developers trying to understand the API. So we'll start with this as kind of our baseline. So what we'll do here is we're going to download this as a RAML file. And the reason I choose RAML here is because that's the native format that's utilized within MuleSoft. If we go the OAS route now, we're going to encounter quite a few issues with various dependencies between the schema and so forth. So we'll do it as a RAML file. Okay. So we've got our specification here that it downloaded. And as you can see, what we're looking at here is the assets which come as part of this API specification, the most important of which is the RAML file. And these represent various dependencies for schemas and examples and so forth. So now if you might think that if we go ahead and just import this directly into your own design studio under Cloudhub, that you'd be good to go and could go in and make modifications, and you could prune the API to meet your specific needs, etc. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually just going to zip this together, and so we can then import it into the Cloudhub Design Studio. So if we go back into MuleSoft's Cloudhub and go under Design Center, so that's one of the available options here. And Design Center is basically their utility or their application that allows you to make changes to an API, to define an API from the very ground up. It's a top-down approach for developing these. So in this case, we've got our API specification that we just downloaded. Okay, after a moment's delay, it will import that API specification into Design Center. And at first blush, everything looks great. You could see the details here of the API and the various endpoints, and you can also then see the dependencies in which that relies upon. So, for instance, you could see the banking types as defined under the Fin Banking library and so forth. And the issue that, however, you'll quickly encounter is that if you then attempt to make any edits or changes to these related dependencies, you're not able to do so. And that's because it imported these as exchange dependencies, which mean that they cannot be edited directly within the Design Center for this. So in my opinion anyway, the best way of approaching this is to perform some cleanup work before we import the specification itself. So towards that end, I'm just going to delete this. And then I'm going to go back to the file system, and we're going to make some changes to make it a bit more usable when importing it. Okay, so we've got our specification here. I'm just going to remove the existing zip file. Now, one of the first things you'll notice is there's several layers of directories that are associated under this main directory, and in part that's just due to how they've set those up. However, I don't think I really want two layers of directories in order to find these associated assets. So I'm just going to copy these up and move them up a level. And I'm actually just going to rename this modules instead of exchange modules to better reflect what they are. Okay, so now we've moved them up to make only one level deep. The next change that we need to perform in order to prevent these from being imported as an exchange dependency is we'll have to make a few minor tweaks to the exchange JSON itself. So I'm going to remove the dependency on the org ID. It will assign it then automatically based on the Cloudhub org that we're working with. Going to remove some of these metadata tags. And most importantly, I'm going to remove the dependency array which lists those dependent resources. So instead of importing them as dependencies, it should import them directly just within the file system we've specified. So if I save here and then go back, and then zip this together, we will try now again to import that one more time and see if it better suits our purpose. Okay, so first thing to notice is that we don't no longer have the exchange dependencies. However, the one thing now that's become clear if we look at the project errors is there's quite a number, and that's because I've changed the directory structure of where those assets are located. Um, so I'm just going to do a bit of a cleanup effort on this. Okay, so that did clean up the errors that were present on the main root RAML definition file. However, as you'll see, there's going to be several other related problems that we're going to have to clean up as well. So if we go into some of these again, it's because I've changed the directory structure of those. It isn't necessarily required, but it just makes things, in my opinion, a bit more manageable. So what we're going to do here is, if we look at the level of where this is found, it looks like it's going to be a couple levels up. See if that, yeah, that cleared it up. So maybe not. Okay. Okay, so that cleaned it up for that one, and then we'll do the same with these others. So that did require a bit of cleanup effort due to the fact that we changed some of the directory structure of the dependencies, but I think overall it makes for a much more manageable API specification. So at this point, we could go through and we could make changes to these endpoints. We could remove the ones that, for instance, are no longer of interest to us. Maybe at this point we're not implementing anything with cards, with credit cards, so we'll just remove those. And so forth. So you can make changes as needed. Get rid of some of these others as well. So now at this point, what we can do is we can actually publish this API into the Cloudhub Exchange. And by way of doing that, we can then export it, for instance, if we so desired, or we could make it accessible to our developer community so they could go in and begin playing around with some of those endpoints. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this. So once this has successfully published it to Exchange, we'll go in there and we can then see the interface, the developers would have who wish to do implementation of this particular API. And that as well, obviously, will lay the groundwork for the actual implementation of the logic itself. So if we go into Anypoint Exchange now, we could see the API that we've created, and we can go ahead and we can test, make dummy tests against the mocking service and so forth, which is very beneficial. It allows you to quickly get this into the hands of those who are going to be utilizing it so that they can begin development at the same time while you actually implement the back-end portions of the API to make it actually a suitable application. One thing as well that you can do at this point is you can also then, if for instance your developers are more accustomed to using OpenAPI or Swagger, you can then export that, and it should be in a much more suitable position now to export than what we had originally. So if we go into, for instance, then the Swagger editor, oh no, why it does that? What we can then do is we can go back to the file system. When you go into the Swagger editor the first time around, it just has, the sample pet store application. But I did want to just illustrate how we can use use it as well. So if I go to what I downloaded as the core banking API, this API JSON itself is now should be a Swagger representation, OpenAPI representation of the same API. So if we go back into here, there are a couple of errors, but we can deal with those later. But as you can see now, it's more of a representation that some of those who are more familiar with working with Swagger and OpenAPI. So that illustrates the way that you can export this. Now, the next section that we're going to be covering is how to create a sample project that actually uses this within Anypoint Studio. And that'll be on our next section. So at this point, we've obviously we're able to set up Design Center with our API specification, and could then therefore go in and use the IDE that comes within the Cloudhub Design Center to make changes and modifications to the API. However, I think in all likelihood, in more of an enterprise setting, you may want to do the authoring of that API within Anypoint Studio, in part because you also want to then most likely save the changes and updates that you make to that API specification to your own GitHub repository. So in order to do that, let's go over to Anypoint Studio, and I'm going to choose the option to import the API specification that we just created. Now, I've previously had logged in using my credentials to Cloudhub from Anypoint Studio, so it did find the API specification that we were working on. So I'll go ahead and select that. And what this will do is this will automatically bring up the API design perspective that comes within Anypoint Studio. And so you can see our different API assets here, and you can then, in a moment, it should render our API. Here we go. Similar to what we saw with Design Center. So if we make updates to our YAML specification, it'll then be reflected in this tab called API Console. Now at this point, I think in a normal scenario, instead of making changes to the master branch and pushing them into Cloudhub's Design Center, in all likelihood, best practice would suggest you'd want to create your own branch. So to do that, we go over to the I'm going to go over to the Git branch, and I'm going to create a new branch. So I went to the Git perspective, I'm sorry. And we'll call this demo branch 1. And I'm going to configure it so that we can immediately begin pushing the updates into API Designer, or within Cloudhub, the Design Center, which is back-ended by Git, as you might imagine, given what we're doing here. So now we've created our new branch. If we go back into the authoring environment, you can see we've switched over to that branch. And so now what we can do is we can make changes to the API specification, and we can push those into Design Center under its own branch. So let's, for instance, get rid of this patch method here under the transactions. We'll go ahead and save that. And what you can see here now is that we have it's recognized, obviously, that we've made a change to this, and we can go ahead and publish that. You can see it's also now reflected in API console. We'll go ahead and publish that to the Design Center as that new branch. So okay, so it obviously automatically recognized the remote that we were working with, and we can go ahead and use that and push it up. So it says that it has worked. So if we switch over back to Design Center, I'll go back to the main Design Center page here, click back on our API specification, we should see now that we have an additional branch. So you can see we have the demo branch 1, which no longer has that method at the end for doing a patch for transactions. As you can see, that's no longer present. So obviously, the fact that the Design Center under the covers is using Git is very convenient. However, I think in most scenarios, what you want to do is you also want to push those updates not only into Design Center, but into your own GitHub repository. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create a new GitHub repository on github.com, just a test public repository. We'll call it Core Banking API Demo. So I'm just going to create this as a public repository. I'm going to copy the location of that. Now, if I go back into Design Center, or I'm sorry, back into Anypoint Studio, and want to again publish this, but this time publish it to GitHub, we will give that a try. So I'm going to push the branch. This time, I'm going to push it into a new remote, and we will call this GitHub. And I had previously authenticated against GitHub using my username and my personal security token as a password. So we've got the new GitHub repository identified here, and we will go ahead and we will push that into now, we'll push it into GitHub. And as you can see, we have our asset there. So what that means is it, if you're familiar at all with Git, what you can do is you can author and make updates to Design Center, because that's a convenient way to share with other developers. And then you can also push it into your own GitHub repository from an enterprise perspective. So that's really what I wanted to cover in this section. What we'll talk about next is, and this will be the final concluding section of this particular presentation, is we'll just illustrate how to stub out the API so that we can begin performing the actual implementation within Anypoint Studio. Thank you. So now what we want to do is we want to actually begin building out our implementation of the actual integration using the API specification that we both originally created in Design Center and then subsequently made some edits with Anypoint Studio and then pushed some of those changes back into Design Center. So there's a couple of different approaches one can take on this. It can sometimes be confusing. But let's go forward under Studio now and do Mule project. So as you can see here, under the API implementation, there's a couple of different options. One is we can import a published API, and then the other one I think of most interest to us is we can actually download the RAML from Design Center. So the implications, however, of doing that is it's going to grab the RAML file and its associated modules and actually incorporate those into your Studio project. So now you've got the API specification both within your Studio project as well as in Design Center. So I don't often think that that's ideal because things can quickly get out of sync. The option that we want to do is we want to instead use an Exchange asset, which is a published API. To do so, however, what we need to do is we need to publish this Design Center specification as a stable release or higher. There's different lifecycle states. As if it's in development, Anypoint Studio will not pull it up. So we're going to publish this out. And it should give us an option here. We'll call it 1.0.0. And we're going to tag it as a stable state, because once we've tagged it as stable, we can then consume it with Anypoint Studio. So this will take just a moment. And what this is doing is it's publishing it out to our own Exchange private repository. So if we go back under Exchange, we should see that there. Yes, we see it. The core banking API. You can see the version that we're currently working on is 1.0, and it's in a stable state. Okay. So now what we can do is we can go back into Studio, and we can do create a new Mule project, and we'll call this core banking API impl. And this time we're going to use a published API, the one that we just published to Exchange. Okay, so the very first asset here that appears, module, is the one that we just published. And it'll indicate that it's the 1.0.0 version. So what this is going to do when we click finish now is it's actually going to stub out the code so that we can begin to create the actual implementation for those endpoints. Okay, so you can see that now it actually code generated these various endpoints for us. And in a subsequent lecture, I'm going to go in and describe how to then build these out into the actual implementation. Um, but at this point, what we've got is we've got the 1.0.0 version. And what's interesting, however, with this is unlike if you had imported it from Design Center, the RAML, you would have seen the API and its related modules under this API directory. In this case, it's not there, and that's because it actually incorporated it as as a as a jar dependency, and you could see that here listed, and so it's 1.0.0.raml. At this point, however, things start becoming a bit more complicated because if you begin building out your implementation now, um, and then you update the API specification through Design Center, there's some issues you may encounter because you don't want it to override and blow away everything that you've been working on. So kind of to illustrate what I mean by that is if we look at this version here, let me see. Yeah, these are the various endpoints. So, but what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and we're going to publish a new version of this API from Design Center. And we're going to do that by going back into Design Center. And this time around, we're going to take the demo branch that we've been working on previously, and we're going to publish this as version 1.1. And again, we're going to specify tag it as a stable release. So this should conclude here in just a moment. Now, if we go back into Exchange, we should see a new version of the API, 1.1.1. And you can see indeed that's the case. 1.1.0, I'm sorry, is the version that we just published. So if we go back into our Studio project, what we can do is we can actually update this jar to reflect the new version. And the way we would do so is we could go under wrong project. We would go under API specs and we would update the version. And the little green indicator there tells us that there's a new version of this available. So I'm going to update the version. So in this case now, you could see that we're now using 1.1.0. Again, this is not necessarily a perfect type scenario because it's careful to not override any existing code that you may have added. Let's say that under the previous 1.0.0 we began to build out our implementation for this get method endpoint here. We created a new flow, and we'll go through this in the next lecture. But, we created a new flow and then we did a flow reference to that. You don't want to have it override the previous work that you did. And so it can be somewhat tricky insofar as when you add a new version of of the API, you may have to then create a new section here, a new subflow to reflect the new endpoint. So if we'd added a new patch or put operation somewhere, it may be required that we then go through and create a new subflow following this same format. And the reason we use that format is that's specified through the API router. And we're going to get into that in the next section in terms of how you actually build out the integration itself. But just wanted to give you a couple of different options as to how you can get started. And that, for now, concludes this series of topics that we covered. And I look forward to seeing you in the next presentation.